Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. There we go. I'll start again. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to get a chance to welcome you to today's conversation. I want to thank our MIT's Department of Economics and the MIT Sloan School for helping to organize the conversation this afternoon. The topic of today's conversation, the new paradigm for financial markets, is also the title of the most recent book by our distinguished guest, George Soros. And as I'm sure we are all acutely aware, there couldn't be a better time or a better place, or frankly, better company for this conversation. MIT has a tradition of being open to hearing controversial views, and in a complex, uncertain time like the present, it's important that we get all views out into conversation. Guiding the conversation this afternoon will be Professor Ricardo Caballero. He is the Ford International Professor of Economics and head of the Department of Economics, which is widely considered among the very best in the world. Professor Caballero is also co-director of the World Economic Laboratory and an NBER Research Associate in Economic Fluctuations and Growth. His own work has particular relevance to this moment. He considers global capital markets, speculative episodes in financial bubbles, and how, or from today's perspective, whether there are mechanisms that could prevent or mitigate systemic crises. Professor Caballero's background is clearly well attuned to the present, but of course, so is that of our guest, George Soros. Starting in the 1970s, George Soros made a name for himself and a fair amount of money as leader of the Quantum Fund, among the original hedge funds, and one whose performance has never been surpassed. More recently, he's made his mark as an author, a brilliant philanthropist, a supporter of emerging democracies, and the founder of the Open Society Institute. He has been prescient in his understanding of the impending financial crisis and its magnitude. He predicted the burst of the housing bubble well in advance of most others and recognized the gravity of the current crisis well before it was obvious to most. We are absolutely delighted to have Mr. Soros here today to engage in a conversation. We welcome him to the MIT campus, and we all look forward to his conversation with Professor Caballero, and the floor will be open for questions after some introductory questions between the two of our guests this afternoon. Thank you very much.
So it's a great honor for me to introduce and moderate a discussion with Mr. George Soros. He's not only a legendary speculator, and his name is a brand in itself, but as Susan mentioned, he has shown a deep concern for making a difference in this world in a wide variety of areas. The book, which provides a background for today's discussion, offers a fascinating mixture of personal experiences, history of science, philosophy of science, real-time finance, economic forecasts, and policy prescriptions, everything in less than 160 pages, or slightly more than 160 pages. But I think one of the points, this book is a bit like a polyphony. There are many layers and many voices, and some of them really sound like music. But I think one of the mega messages of the book is that it makes sense to talk about all these things at the same time, because they are intertwined through the principle of reflexivity. And trying to disentangle them, to talk about things in isolation, as we tend to do in the natural sciences, risks missing the big picture. And that's sort of a subliminal and sometimes explicit message present in the book. The book is a powerful explanation of how rigid imposition of simple equilibrium models can lead to counterfactual predictions and inappropriate policy recommendations. I really share that view. Moreover, I would argue that that's very distinctive of MIT's economics department. It's an eclectic department where we don't shy away from looking at the frictions, even though it makes our models a bit clumsier. but I think we try to focus on the frictions and understanding how those frictions modify the outcomes of the simple models and how they fundamentally change, many times fundamentally change the policy prescription. So it's important for us, Mr. Soros, that somebody with your wisdom and with your experience supports this research agenda. It's very encouraging to us. Now, the plan for today, as an understanding, is that I will ask a few questions. I will try to guide you through the book. So I will at least attempt to follow the structure of the book, but I understand that you may want to deviate, and you have a good tradition in doing so, but that will make it only more interesting. So I'll try to follow the book, and I want to separate the set of questions into 4 groups. The first one is the early chapters, is about your life and how the concept of reflexivity developed, again, as a result of your growth in both in your life and in the financial markets. Then I want us to start moving towards the crisis, but rather than plunging directly in the current crisis, I want to talk to you about the structure, the global structure, the financial structure, the economic structure, what you call the super bubble. And then I want us to understand a bit how the real estate bubble fits within the super bubble. And finally, I want us to conclude with the current crisis. The book is fascinating. It stops halfway through the crisis. And so there's a few chapters to be written, and probably we can discuss them right here.
Well, it's a long agenda you got, so
yes.
I hope we can cover
so I'll interrupt
all.
you frequently, so we keep it then. So the first question is, I would like you to tell us a little bit about your early steps in life in the financial world, and how that led to the reflexivity principle and ideas.
Well, looking back, I would say that the formative year of my life was 1944. Being a Hungarian Jew, Hungary was occupied by the Germans, and we would have been deported and killed in Auschwitz. Fortunately, my father had some previous experience with far from equilibrium situations like this, because he lived through the Russian Revolution. So with that experience, he understood that there are times when the normal rules don't apply. And so he took care of his family and a number of other people in false papers and so on. And we survived, all of us, most of us survived that period. And that was, in a way, the sort of the formative experience of my life. Then I went to England, studied economics. I didn't get much past the elementary economics, perfect competition with the assumption of perfect knowledge. And at the same time, I was reading Karl Popper, Open Society and Its Enemies, which was probably the most influential book in my intellectual development, because his explanation of fascism and communism, after I've experienced both of them, was very enlightening to me. And of course, the idea of perfect knowledge was totally opposed to his theory of science. And so that's when I started thinking about the relationship between us as thinking participants and the reality of our situation. And that was the beginning of and this really when I formulated this idea of reflexivity.
One interesting concept here is that in economics we have, typically when we try to understand multiple equilibria, which we call indeterminacy, we exchange the terms, that arises in economics. We use it to explain crisis because essentially it's very difficult to find shocks out there which are large enough to explain what happens in a crisis, these very large implosions of asset prices and so on. But the typical way it works in economics is by this occurs in situations where we care too much about the expectations of others. Mm-hmm. And you seem to have found that in a sort of broader and even principle, which is this principle of reflexivity. It seems to apply far more broadly than the very specific circumstances where we find it. Mm-hmm. So the question is why? Why is it so encompassing?
Look, let's say the basic proposition. and this may be helpful. I mean, the book deals with 4 levels of abstraction. There was this level of reflexivity as a general concept, which states that there's a structural difference between natural phenomena and human phenomena, because in natural phenomena, thinking doesn't enter into the phenomena themselves. So there's only a cognitive function of trying to understand what goes on. Whereas in human situations, you also have a participating function. You actually try to change the situation. So on the one hand, you have the cognitive function where your thinking supposed to reflect reality. On the other hand, you've got this manipulative or participating function where you affect reality. And those 2 functions interfere with each other, as a result of which neither function has a determinate result. So you can't base your decisions on knowledge, because you are affecting what you are thinking about, and therefore your actions have unintended consequences. And so your imperfect understanding is a very important influence in determining the course of events. So this path dependence is very much due to imperfect understanding.
I mean, in economics, we do take into account that, but you seem to be saying something beyond that, which is that somehow stories are always going to be different. Mm-hmm. Is that you can't predict how people will react to this participation.
Well, I mean, the idea that you should be able to predict the future is really a nonsense, because the future is determined by the decisions that people take. And since they don't base their decisions on knowledge or on, call it, rational expectations, their decisions, I mean, you know, the way Secretary Paulson reacted to Lehman Brothers.
We're going to talk about that.
I mean, I just bring that up as an example. You know, that changed the course of history. So how could you predict that? So, I mean, I think that I have a theory that explains the current crisis better than, let's say, the prevailing paradigm. But it cannot predict it. And I find it very frustrating that, you know, with all my great, deep understanding, I don't get the market right.
Well, you get it right more frequently than others, no? That's what matters at the end. There is another concept, and this is the last conceptual question before we get into the crisis, but there's another concept in economics which is called social learning, and that's essentially that you know, we learn from the actions of others. Mm-hmm. And in those models, what typically happens is that the early entrants make money and the late entrants lose money, mm-hmm. and typically ruin the business. Mm-hmm. And I think you say this very nicely in your book. I think you call it the Peters principle. You say ideas that work well will be exploited to the point that they do not work anymore. Mm-hmm. And you seem to be saying that the reflexivity principle will always imply that. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, how did you come to this idea?
No, I mean, as a working hypothesis, you see, you have this, let's say, rational expectations theory that markets are always right. And I think as a working hypothesis, it's much better to assume that the markets are always wrong. In other words, there's always reflect the existing state of affairs in a distorted or biased way. But the prevailing perception of the market actually affects the so-called fundamentals that market prices are supposed to reflect. That's the reflexivity. And that's something that is endemic. That is the nature of financial systems. Now, bubbles are a particular manifestation of this two-way connection, where initially you always have a misconception involved. But initially, reality actually confirms, reinforces both the trend and the misconception. So it becomes a self-reinforcing process until the misinterpretation of reality becomes so glaring that it's unsustainable. Then usually you have a kind of a period where people go on, dancing even though they realize that, the music is about to stop, or, and then you have a reversal. So it's a non-linear process. That's a bubble which is initially self-reinforcing and eventually self-defeating, so reversed. Now, this doesn't happen very often. It's actually more the exception than the rule, because usually markets actually correct their own mistakes. So the feedback that you get from the market initially is self-defeating. The misconception is defeated. But occasionally you have this self-reinforcing.
Is there a pattern in this occasionally?
Pardon?
Is there a pattern in this occasionally? When does it happen? Is it policy mistakes? Is it?
Well, there's always two elements. There is a trend that occurs in reality. It can be, let's say, ever-increasing use of leverage. Mm-hmm. That's one of the effects. Or it can be the discovery of internet and the technological innovation that goes with it. That's something that really happens. And then there's a misinterpretation. And those two elements interact in a reflexive way, and occasionally they set off this self-reinforcing process. That's how you had the internet bubble. That was based on this misinterpretation of technical development or innovation. And the other one is typical. The most common bubble is actually in real estate. Mm-hmm. Yes. And there, the misconception is that the price of the real estate is independent of the willingness to lend. And strangely, this is a misconception that keeps on recurring in different guises throughout history.
Before we get into the real estate bubble, though, let's talk about the real one, the
yes.
super bubble.
Right.
Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Well, you see, so you have this, just to take you down the abstractions. First, you have this theory of natural phenomena and human phenomena having a different structure. Then you have the application in financial markets, which is, I think, endemic. It's always there. But then you have the specific bubble formation is one manifestation of reflexivity, but you have others, and some others are there all the time. And then you have the interpretation of this particular bubble, where I contend that you have the housing bubble in the US, which was just a relatively small bubble. It was like a detonator, which then set off a much bigger explosion of the super bubble. And that super bubble has been growing for at least 25 years. And it has two components. One is expansion of credit and use of leverage. And the other one is a misconception, which I call market fundamentalism, a belief that markets can correct their own mistakes and markets should be left to their own devices. And that became the dominant creed around 1980, with Margaret Thatcher in England, Reagan in the US, and it led to the globalization of financial markets, the deregulation of financial markets, and the freedom to engage in financial engineering. And the financial engineering was based on this false concept of markets tending towards equilibrium and deviations being random, which neglects the possibility of self-reinforcing processes, was left out of account.
Well,
was assumed away.
Regulation is supposed to take care of that.
Yeah, but then the regulators themselves believed that markets are self-regulating. And you see, what happened was, because this belief was false, actually, markets left to their own devices created one crisis after another. But each time, the regulators intervened, and they solved the problem. They merged away the failing institution, Continental Illinois, or the savings and loans, or whatever it was, and provided fiscal stimulus or monetary stimulus in order to avoid the real economy being affected. And so these financial crises, periodic financial crises, served as successful tests of the misconception of market fundamentalism. And this financial crisis, it plays a different role. This is the reversal point. This is when the authorities have lost control, cannot deal with and you have a real collapse. So the periodic crises serve to reinforce the misconception.
Now, associated to this collapse of the super bubble, you also talk about the collapse of the US-centric world and things of that nature.
Well, I mean, this has a lot to do with it because market fundamentalism and the global financial system has the United States as the dominant force within it. It's the Washington consensus that prevailed. And it served the interests of the United States extremely well, because with the authorities ensuring that the system, if it's threatened, will not collapse, they were a little bit less concerned about the countries at the periphery of the system. So if they got into trouble, then they were subject to market discipline. And they took the consequences. So you had very severe, the first big crisis was the international banking crisis that came to a head in 1982 with Mexico saying, you know, I'm about to default. So then the central banks got together, they saved the system, but they didn't save Mexico. Mexico went through the ringer, and so did Latin America. Latin America had a decade loss.
Chilean. I remember the experience very well.
You know it well.
Yes.
and
that's the reason I'm here.
Right. And that's why you have some sympathy with my position. So, and then you had also, you had then in 1997, you had the emerging market crisis. But again, when it came to long-term capital management defaulting or about to default, the system was held together. The Indonesia, Korea, and so on went through the ringer. So because of that, capital felt safer, financial capital felt safer at the center. So America was able to suck up the savings of the world. And for 25 years, we have had an ever-increasing budget deficit, current account deficit, which eventually reached 6.5%, 7% of GDP. And we've been consuming more than we were producing. And that was, so we had the benefit of the system. And I had a conversation on this subject with Alan Greenspan. I asked him to read my book. He was kind enough to do it. And we then discussed it. And he said, you know, actually, financial innovation brings such great benefits that it outweighs the cost of having occasional bubbles, and then you have to pick up the pieces. And actually, until this crisis, on a cost-benefits basis, he had an argument, because you have had a period of unprecedented prosperity in the United States.
Well,
if you think of
Keynes made the same point about the Great Depression, actually, many years back.
Right, right. So until now, it was self-justifying, until eventually it became self-defeating. And we are now in the self-defeating.
But let me bring you back to the US-centric world. You seem to be implying that now savings will not come to the US, but there aren't that many alternatives. I mean, Europe doesn't look much better. Japan doesn't look much better. The emerging markets were safe until a week ago, but now they're in trouble as well. So,
well, this is the really fascinating thing, because this is the important thing to realize about this crisis, that this was not an extraneous shock, as the prevailing paradigm would tell you, that it's always an external shock that the system can't absorb. This is not an external shock. This was generated inside the system, so it's self-generated. Secondly, it originated at the center, and it affected the center. But in the end, even now, after the mistake of allowing Lehman to default, that was the turning point where things fell apart, and effectively the financial system genuinely melted down. And so the authorities had to throw all consideration of moral hazard out of the window. By the end of the week, Secretary Paulson came with his $700 billion plan. And then, when that didn't work, eventually, after just in the last 2-3 weeks, basically all the developed countries decided they can't allow another major institution to go in default, and effectively guaranteed depositors for their deposits. That gave some confidence to people at the center. And then there was an unintended consequence, a flood of capital away from the periphery back to the center. So in the end, the periphery got hit more heavily, even now. And I will argue in an article that will be published in tomorrow's Financial Times that we have got to do something. The IMF has a new mission. It has to protect the periphery countries against the storm at the center.
Well, that was the old mission, or the intermediate mission of the IMF. Now it's going back to the original mission,
right.
Bretton Woods II.
Right.
So you have views on that?
Right.
On Bretton Woods II, is something we should do or not?
Yeah. So this is why the system lasted that long, because it actually benefited those who were in charge of the global financial system, namely the United States, with its veto power in the IMF.
I suspect, though, that it's going to be hard to turn that around for the reasons you mentioned. The US-centric system, because it's going to continue to be the most attractive system, because at the end of the day, you do whatever you do to save the center, and therefore the periphery is less certain.
I don't think so. I think that unless actually the United States now leads a international effort to stabilize the system, which includes the periphery countries, I think the system will not continue.
Oh, I agree with you, but I see no possibility that they don't try to stabilize the US.
No,
and then
but I think that I mean, I don't expect this president to do it.
Oh, that's...
But I expect...
That's a different thing.
But I expect the next president to do it, because otherwise